Imagine standing at the intersection of some of the darkest and most defining moments in human history, not as a spectator, but as a man forced to endure them firsthand. Joe Lee Kiyoomia's story is not just the tale of a soldier, it is the tale of survival when everything, nature, enemies, and fate itself conspired against him. He lived through the brutality of the Bataan Death March, where starvation, exhaustion, and cruelty claimed thousands of lives. He endured years of merciless imprisonment where his body was broken but his will remained unyielding, even when the Japanese tortured him in the mistaken belief that he could unlock the secrets of the Navajo code. And when fate had one more trial to throw his way, he found himself in Nagasaki on the very day the atomic bomb fell, surviving the inferno that consumed a city in seconds. His life was not just touched by war, it was swallowed by it, tested by it, and ultimately defined by the extraordinary resilience it demanded. When we speak of heroes, we often imagine generals commanding armies or politicians making speeches that echo across nations. But Joe's heroism was of a quieter, grittier kind, the kind found in the grit of a march where every step might be your last, the kind found in a prison cell where silence meant defiance, and the kind found in simply breathing again after the sky itself had exploded. What makes his story remarkable is not only what he survived, but the truth that his survival carried meaning beyond himself, shining a light on the endurance of the human spirit and the strength of his Navajo identity. His journey was one of pain, yes, but also of profound testimony, because each impossible moment he overcame became proof that resilience is stronger than destruction and hope endures even in the ashes. Joe Lee Kieyoomia was born into the proud traditions of the Navajo people, a nation whose resilience had already been tested for generations before the Second World War ever began. He grew up in a culture of strength, community, and identity, where the rhythm of life was guided by both the harshness of the land and the richness of Navajo traditions. When war came knocking, Joe was not just another young man drafted into the fight. He was a Navajo soldier stepping into a global conflict where his identity would both define him and, tragically, be used against him. Like thousands of other Native Americans who answered the call, he fought for a country that often overlooked or misunderstood his people, yet he carried his uniform with pride, determined to serve. His enlistment was not simply an act of duty, but a bridge between his heritage and his commitment to the defense of freedom at a time when the world teetered on the edge of collapse. The war in the Pacific was unforgiving, and Joe's path soon led him to the Philippines, where American and Filipino forces braced against the relentless advance of Japanese troops. The battles were brutal, fought not only against a determined enemy but against disease, hunger, and the crushing sense that reinforcements were not coming. For Joe, the early days of the campaign were filled with courage and comradeship, but as the Japanese encircled Bataan, hope began to thin. The eventual fall of Bataan in April 1942 marked one of the darkest chapters in American military history, and Joe was caught directly in its collapse. For a Navajo soldier who had stepped into war carrying the weight of his people's legacy, this surrender was not just a military defeat, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would test him in ways unimaginable. The fall of Bataan was not the end of suffering, but the doorway to an ordeal so merciless it would be etched forever into history as the Bataan Death March. Captured soldiers, already weakened by hunger and disease, were forced to march nearly 70 miles under a blazing sun, with little food, little water, and no compassion from their captors. Men collapsed from exhaustion, only to be beaten or bayoneted where they fell, while others were shot for merely slowing down. The road was littered with the broken bodies of comrades, and the air itself seemed heavy with death, despair, and the cruel indifference of the guards. For Joe Lee Kieyoomia, each step was not just a struggle against physical exhaustion, but against the rising tide of hopelessness that sought to swallow every man alive. Yet within that march of horror, the will to live flickered stubbornly in Joe's spirit. Every moment was a decision, to place one more foot forward, to breathe one more breath, to endure one more hour of thirst and pain. He witnessed unimaginable cruelty, but he also saw sparks of humanity as prisoners supported each other, shared drops of water, and whispered words of encouragement when their bodies had no strength left. The death march was designed to strip men of dignity and reduce them to shadows, but Joe's endurance was proof that even in the harshest crucible, the spirit could resist breaking. By the time he reached the prison camps, scarred and weakened, Joe was no longer the same man who had entered the war. He was a survivor marked by horror, yet still unbroken, still alive, still defiant against the fate that tried to claim him. Surviving the Bataan Death March was only the beginning of Joe Lee Kieyoomia ordeal, for captivity brought with it a different kind of suffering, one that stretched on not for days, but for years. In the prison camps, life was reduced to a grim cycle of hunger, disease, and brutality, where each morning was a question mark: would he live to see another dusk? The Japanese guards imposed not just physical torment but psychological warfare, determined to break the will of their captives and force them into submission. For Joe, this trial was compounded by his identity as a Navajo, which, instead of being a forgotten detail, became the very reason he was singled out for some of the most brutal treatment. The Japanese believed he was one of the famed Navajo code talkers, the men whose unbreakable code was crippling their communications, and they were determined to extract secrets from him that he did not even possess. Joe was subjected to torture designed to crush the body and unravel the mind, beaten and forced to endure unspeakable pain in the hope that he would betray knowledge he simply did not have. The cruel irony was that he was not trained as a code talker, and no matter how much they hurt him, he could not give them what they wanted. Yet in this unbearable torment lay the deepest expression of his resilience. He held firm, enduring agony while knowing that silence was itself an act of defiance. Every time he refused to give in, every time he resisted, he carried not only his own dignity but also the dignity of his people and his fellow prisoners. His defiance became more than survival. It was a stand against oppression, proof that even a man stripped of everything could still wield power through courage, endurance, and an unbroken spirit. As if the death march and years of captivity were not enough, fate had one final crucible for Joe Lee Kieyoomia, a trial that would thrust him into the very center of history's most devastating weapon. By 1945, as the war dragged toward its bloody climax, Joe found himself transferred to a prison in Nagasaki, a city that would soon be marked forever in human memory. The prison cell that confined him was not meant to be merciful. It was cold, dark, and oppressive, but in one of history's strangest twists, it would prove to be his unlikely shield. On the morning of August 9, 1945, when the atomic bomb exploded over Nagasaki, the city was instantly transformed into a vision of fire and death, with tens of thousands consumed in a single blinding moment. Buildings were reduced to rubble, lives to shadows on walls, and the very air became poison. Yet deep inside the prison, Joe survived, protected by the thick stone walls that had once felt like his curse. The blast wave shattered the world above him, but the confinement that had symbolized his suffering became the reason for his survival. When he finally emerged, the sight that met him was beyond imagination. Streets reduced to ashes, survivors wandering burned and dazed, the city transformed into a silent graveyard. Joe was not spared from the horror. He carried burns, wounds, and memories that would never fade, yet he lived through an event that defined the 20th century. To survive both man's cruelty in the death march and the most powerful weapon ever unleashed was almost unthinkable, yet Joe's life became a testament to endurance when even the sky itself turned into fire. His survival in Nagasaki was not chance alone. It was the culmination of every act of resilience, every refusal to give in, every stubborn decision to keep breathing when everything else screamed to let go. When the war finally ended and the prison gates opened, Joe Lee Kieyoomia stepped back into a world that was free, but freedom did not erase the scars that captivity had carved into him. He returned home to the United States as one of the lucky few who had survived the death march, the prison camps, and even the atomic bomb, yet luck felt like a complicated word when so many of his comrades never came back. His body bore the marks of torture and starvation, and his spirit carried memories that could never be fully spoken, memories that returned in nightmares and silence rather than in words. The America he came back to was celebrating victory, waving flags, and moving forward into a new era. But for Joe, the echoes of war followed him everywhere, making even ordinary days feel heavy with remembrance. He was both a soldier and a survivor, caught between the gratitude of being alive and the burden of living with everything he had seen and endured. Life after war was not simple, for the world around him did not always understand the depth of the battles he still fought within himself. Like many veterans, he faced the challenge of rebuilding a life, finding a place in a society that could not fully comprehend the horrors he had lived through. His Navajo heritage, once a source of suspicion to his captors, became a wellspring of strength as he leaned on tradition, culture, and identity to steady himself in a world that often overlooked native veterans. Even as he tried to move forward, the memories of Bataan, the years of imprisonment, and the fire of Nagasaki lived with him, reminding him that survival was not just a moment in time, but a lifelong journey. Joe's return to civilian life was not the closing of his story, but the opening of a new chapter, one where resilience meant not just surviving war, but learning how to live again in the shadow of its memory. Joe Lee Kiyoomia's life was more than a personal story of survival. It became a mirror reflecting the power of resilience and the unshakable strength of identity. His journey showed that resilience is not born in moments of ease, but forged in fire, in hunger, in silence, and in the refusal to let cruelty define the soul. The death march, the prison walls, and even the atomic bomb were all meant to erase him, yet each attempt at destruction only deepened his will to endure. His strength was not only physical, it was cultural, rooted in the Navajo traditions that taught him endurance, patience, and the value of holding on when the storm seems endless. In every trial, he carried with him the lessons of his people, lessons that told him that no matter how harsh the land or how cruel the enemy, the spirit of the Navajo could not be broken. Identity became both his curse and his shield, for it was the very reason he was tortured, mistaken as a code talker, yet it was also the very root of his inner strength. While the Japanese tried to exploit his heritage, what they could not understand was that his Navajo identity gave him an unbreakable core, a sense of belonging that no prison walls could erase. In a world where native voices were often silenced, Joe's story became a quiet but powerful testament that being Navajo was not a weakness, but a source of unshakable strength. His resilience was not simply about surviving cruelty, but about surviving with dignity intact, carrying the pride of his people even in the darkest moments. Through his life, we see that resilience is not just enduring hardship, but transforming it into a legacy, one that speaks across generations about courage, identity, and the unyielding human spirit. For many years after the war, Joe Lee Kieyoomia carried his memories quietly, choosing silence over storytelling, not because his story lacked power, but because its weight was often too heavy to place into words. Like many survivors, he lived with the ghosts of what he had endured, haunted not only by the images of suffering, but also by the unanswered question of why he was spared when so many others were not. The silence was a shield, a way of protecting himself and those around him from horrors that could never be fully understood outside the circle of men who had lived them. His family, his community, and even his fellow veterans sometimes struggled to bridge the gap between his quiet presence and the unfathomable history he carried within him. Behind that silence, however, lay a story that deserved recognition, a story that belonged not only to Joe but to every man who suffered and resisted under the shadow of war. In time, the world began to take notice, and recognition came slowly but meaningfully as historians, veterans groups, and communities sought to honor his resilience. His survival of both the Bataan Death March and the atomic bombing of Nagasaki set him apart as a unique witness to history, a man whose very life stood at the crossroads of cruelty and endurance. Yet recognition was never just about medals or public praise. It was about ensuring that memory itself endured, that future generations would not forget the sacrifices and resilience of men like Joe. His story became part of a larger effort to remember native veterans whose contributions had often been overlooked, shining a light on the dignity and courage of the Navajo people. In his memory, silence was finally broken by acknowledgement, and recognition became a way of transforming pain into legacy, ensuring that his life continued to speak even when he himself chose not to. Joe Lee Kiyoomia's life stands as a reminder that history is not only measured in battles won or nations rebuilt, but also in the resilience of individuals who refuse to be broken. His journey through the Death March, the years of torture, and the fire of Nagasaki was not a single story of survival, but a series of victories of spirit over destruction, of courage over despair, of endurance over annihilation. He endured when the body had no strength left, he resisted when his captors demanded submission, and he survived even when the sky itself rained death. In every trial, he showed that heroism is not always found in glory or recognition, but often in the quiet, unyielding will to continue when everything around you demands surrender. His legacy is not just that he lived, but that his survival became a voice for the countless who could not tell their stories, a light for those lost in history's shadows. As we remember Joe, we are called to remember more than a soldier. We are called to remember a man, a Navajo son, a survivor whose strength speaks across time. His story belongs to every person who has faced impossible trials and chosen not to give in, every community that has carried scars yet stood tall, every generation that wonders what resilience truly means. Joe's life teaches us that resilience is not the absence of suffering, but the courage to endure it, transform it, and carry it forward with dignity. And so, his name deserves to be spoken, his story deserves to be told, and his spirit deserves to be honored, not just in history books, but in our hearts, in our classrooms, and in every moment we are tempted to believe that hope has no place in suffering. Joe Lee Kiyoomia's unbreakable spirit reminds us that no matter how dark the night, the human soul can rise again and again to meet the dawn.